So my name is Hadeel Almubarak. I'm currently enrolled in Foodways in the Anthropocene, a class that explores all kinds of questions about our global food system, whether it's through its consumption, its production, and over time. So today I chose to interview Abdulaziz AlMulla, founder of Madar Farms. Our conversation today is going to talk about his initiatives on food practices here in the UAE and how he decided to found this business. Not only that, but we want to talk about food practices in the Gulf in general, the challenges we face being here in the Gulf, and what are the initiatives that Abdulaziz is participating in, but also what the broader public should engage in. So Abdulaziz, welcome to this podcast. How are you doing today?
Thank you great. Thank you for having me, and welcome to all the listeners or viewers. I'm very excited to be here. I think, as you'll see throughout the conversation, one of our big things is about raising awareness and education level. So happy to be here.
We're happy to have you. So just an introduction to those that are not aware of Madar Farms. How would you introduce it to them, and how would you tell the story of its inception?
Sure. So the story of inception, it's an interesting one. I was actually working as a management consultant for a company called McKinsey here in the region. And we were looking at national security. National security being looking at food, water, but also energy security, IT, healthcare, etc. And just thinking about what are the biggest challenges we face as a country or as a government, and proactively managing those risks in terms of the likelihood and impact. I was actually on a completely different track. I was looking at healthcare and IT security. But the more I started looking at food and water, which was a little bit, let's say, underserved at the time by the public sector, and this is 6 years ago now, the more I realized what a big problem it was. Alhamdulillah, I think now we're a lot more aware than we used to be. But 6 years ago, even at that time, we all knew we had a problem in food and water. But it was really the scale and the imminence of the problem that terrified me. You know, learning numbers like more than 80% of water use in the region is agriculture and irrigation, but less than 1% of our land is permanent or arable cropland. And we import more than 90% of our food. And the math just doesn't add up there. And that's what sent me on a little bit of a soul-searching period. You know, I took a sabbatical. I traveled the globe, everywhere from Japan to Holland, the UK, the States, just looking at what people were doing and trying to find some sort of approach to this. You know, when I first started, it wasn't like I had a clear idea or a clear, go-to-market strategy or any of the typical things that you would associate with starting a business. But I knew that there was a big problem. I knew that there was something that could be done to solve it. And yeah, I think 6 months after that, I settled here in the UAE and doing something in the hydroponic and indoor farming space. And what we're a food security company. Because the biggest lever for water security is food, we decided on tackling that, and kind of having two birds with one stone. And so we founded the Madar Farms in 2017, spent a couple of years literally alone in the desert, me and a couple of guys just farming and learning, because it was the first time something like this had been really done here, having that educational experience, both internally and externally, and happy to talk about that. But today, Lillah alhamd, we're a much larger team. We're both in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. We have our R&D center where we do a lot of our research and development work here locally. And what we're building today in Abu Dhabi, in KeyZad, is the world's largest indoor vine crop growing facility, and hoping to expand that out across product families.
That's amazing. I think, Abdulaziz, you touched on a lot of things I really want to ask you more about. I'm born in this country, and every time I go to the supermarket, there's just an array of produce, and they're all imported. And I think, when that's what you usually see every single time, you think that's normal, and you think that's, what's happening across the globe. But last semester, I spent a couple of months studying in Florence, and most of the produce there was from the same region that Florence was in, and if not, other regions in Italy. I mean, none of their produce was imported. And of course, most of their produce was seasonal because it is local. After coming back, I saw this very large shift between our practices of food consumption in Florence and in Abu Dhabi. And I just wanted to know, was this something that struck you from your travels? And of course, this isn't a sustainable way to live. What are your thoughts about it?
Sure. So I think first there are three key components. I think One is it's difficult to compare different markets because each market and each country, they have their own both advantages and disadvantages when it comes to agricultural production, but also consumer preferences. And this is incredibly important when it comes to growing because in the end, most farmers are going to decide to grow what will get them the greatest net profit. You have to understand agriculture as it's grown over the last 100 years has focused on growing more, in terms of volumes at all costs. Now, what's happened with that is it's become a commoditized product. We think about what can I grow that I can ship to places that don't have it? How can I grow more of it? And that comes with its whole system of problems. So I think that's one thing that we have to think about. Second portion, which is key there, is knowledge and awareness. So growing up in this region, when you go to the supermarket, you're absolutely right. In fact, it's colloquially iceberg lettuce. We call it lettuce American, American lettuce, because that's what we know it as. And that's seen as kind of like the quality standard. Whereas in reality, iceberg lettuce was created specifically for this region to be shipped from the US because it's a very heavy crop. It's actually logistically, as the shape of it, it can be stocked and take the largest amount of a container's volume, and it doesn't bruise easily. So it was actually created as like a category B or low category product to be shipped. It's not nutrient dense at all. It's majority water, but we consider it better just because it's imported. And if you ask kids, where do we get our vegetables from? The majority of the response today you're going to get is supermarket. They're not going to tell you the farm because that's the lack of exposure they have. And that's one of the key challenges both we face and we're trying to solve. And as an example, we wrote our own curriculum and launched it called Sustainable Futures. And this is a curriculum that goes into schools where kids actually, not only they're exposed to content, but they have small farms installed in their schools where they can farm themselves, learn about hydroponics, learn about sustainable agriculture, learn what's possible to start to change the mindset. And I think the final component of what you brought up is the power of the consumer. When you go to Lily and you say it's seasonal and you're looking there, you get used to a certain level of quality. You get used to having a certain level of expectations. If we're not aware of what's available and we don't ask for something better, then retailers, distributors, the people who are bringing us food, they're not going to have an incentive to change. I think in the last few years, especially with COVID, there's been a shift in awareness, locally, regionally, in terms of an understanding of questioning where our food comes from and questioning what goes into our food. 48% of UAE respondents said that they would change their food habits if they knew that there were chemicals inside their food, insecticides and pesticides. That's the vast majority of the food that's coming in because that's what it needs to survive the journey. So being able to bridge the gap of taking that knowledge and turning it into a general voice of the customer that will generate change. And that's been happening recently. So you'll see more local offerings, but there's still a long way to go. We're still a drop in the ocean in terms of the change that's happened and that needs to happen.
Yeah, actually, speaking about that, I know that now blueberries are grown in the UAE. My mom just came back yesterday with some local blueberries. And also, I've been to Spinneys a couple of times, our branch in Abu Dhabi, and there's a company that grows cherry tomatoes. It comes in a cardboard box and it's biodegradable. And I think it's interesting to see this shift because previously, when I was younger, I don't remember seeing local produce, but maybe I wasn't conscious of it.
I think also a big component is going back to this. We still do have this concept that has been imported through generations because local production wasn't as mass volume, that imported is better. It is completely wrong. It's heads over where local produce for many reasons is better. And I'll get into that, but that creates a friction for the local farmer. So forget today the modern farmer, but even previously, there were local farms and there was local production. Sheikh Zayed Al Yarhama actually had one of the largest greenhouse saltwater farms in the world back in the 60s and 70s in Abu Dhabi, growing cucumbers, growing tomatoes, growing peppers. But most people don't know that. And this comes down to this concept of imported, or, Dutch is better, Italian is better, French produce is better, but that's not always the case. So a lot of our local farms, what ends up happening is they would go to the commoditized market. They would go to the markets where they're dealing in the tons. They wouldn't make their way into high-end retailers like Spinneys, where customers who care about quality, customers who can have that shift and be able to pass on a premium to farmers and encourage them to grow, encourage them to do different happens. Today, I think with a lot of the public sector initiatives that are happening with the change in awareness, suddenly you're seeing a lot of local farms sprout up, whether that's, your typical greenhouse or whether that's extreme end where we are doing controlled environment agriculture and indoor farming. And so, it's not just blueberries and tomatoes, it's lettuces, salads, all types of leafy greens, microgreens, vine crops, etc. And I think that's going to continue. Now, going back to the imported versus local, at a very basic level, regardless of the way that one is growing, just to import it, that's a lot of food miles. The produce that you're getting, it's not fresh, and it has to be sprayed with a lot of things to keep it as fresh as possible to get to you. Just from that basic point of view, you already know that the product that you're getting versus the product that's harvested a day ago or hours ago or a couple of days ago from here, just from a freshness point of view, is better. And of course, the climate change impact that happens, even if something is grown sustainably abroad, all that sustainability is lost in shipping it all the way over here. And an example I like to use is, imagine you're about to get on a flight and you're going to go to another country. Obviously, by the time you arrive, you kind of want to take a shower and, refresh yourselves. Like, don't you wish the same could happen to your vegetables? But they don't get the same chance. And now with the value offering here happening, we need to support local farmers. But again, that goes back to education, that goes back to awareness and being able to change consumer habits.
Yeah, I actually think just yesterday we were talking about the impact of, the global food system on climate change and on carbon emissions. And I think one of my professors was saying that 1/3 of all carbon emissions come from the global food system. So whether that's like logistically, but I think that's crazy. That's where a problem arises when thinking imported is better, because you're just contributing to that problem without understanding just how bad that decision can be to the environment.
And it's a destructive cycle, because what's happening is it's well over a third, actually. I think it's almost up to 40%. And there's different contributors, obviously. There's the transportation logistics, there's the amount of water consumption that goes. Most people don't know that, your average cheeseburger, the 200-gram beef patty takes almost 1,000 liters of water to grow. And we know that we're not water secure globally. Forget here in the region as well. What's actually happening is this is accelerating climate change. And climate change is decreasing yields of farmers globally. The increasing volatility is decreasing their earnings globally. And so to compensate for that, most farmers are going towards synthetic chemicals and synthetic additives to combat that and to increase their yields, etc. But not all of that stays in the soil, and you're damaging the soil, and there's nitrogen runoff that goes into the water, and that contributes further to climate change. And then you're in this self-destructive cycle. And so the terrifying thing about it is change cannot just happen at an individual level, can't just happen at a public sector level or a company farmer level. It's an entire system overhaul that has to happen. And as well, there's not one particular technology or one particular approach. The problem is across the entire value chain, whether it's in transportation, whether it's in livestock, whether it's in how we feed the animals themselves. We're over a third self-sufficient in poultry and eggs in the UAE, but almost 100% of that feed is actually coming from abroad. So is that true self-sufficiency? And the way that feed is grown is incredibly water intensive and is imported. Whose responsibility is it for that water intensive crop to be grown? Is it us as the importer, encouraging people to change, or is it the original country or the original grower? It's almost like you're exporting that responsibility to somebody else.
Yeah, I actually think we are reading an article about how Al Mara'i has bought farms in California to supply their feed. And that's another part of that cyclical.
So it's California, it's countries in Eastern Africa, Central Africa. One of the biggest imbalances in food is that you have a lot of countries with land banks and with water banks and that are desperate for economic development. And unfortunately, what's happening, and this is not regionally focused, this is an international global problem, is we're shifting the water extractive problems that we have in certain areas and shifting them to other areas that have no other choice but to do subsistence farming. And that's not just for livestock. I mean, think about coffee. Think about the water that goes into coffee, chocolate, etc. And a lot of the farmers who are at the original farm, they make, single-digit percentages of what the end product is selling for. I think the big takeaway is that the system itself is broken. Modern agriculture hasn't really had major revolution over the last 100 years. Over the last 100 years, it's been the same. Get tractors, produce more. Since the Industrial Revolution, we haven't had that chance. And what we're experiencing now is what people call the third or sometimes the fourth agricultural revolution, where technology advances in other areas are being integrated in agriculture. So as an example for us, the development of IoT. So we're able to monitor our crops and control our climate perfectly. And so we're able to have a much more secure production schedule. And we're able to offer that to retailers and distributors and customers, where we take the volatility out of the supply chain. We're able to give consistent quality. That comes then with a certain value proposition that we're able to start to have more powerful, more impactful conversation. But not just limited to us. If we think about blockchain, the first thing that comes to mind is cryptocurrency. But blockchain today is being used to trace food and to know where food came from and to know what went into growing it. And with that transparency, customers can encourage change. Customers can make more informed decisions. And so where we are today is very exciting because the realm of what can be done and the realm of what can be disrupted in the food industry, as you've seen from your studies, is vast, both in terms of range and in terms of scale.
Yeah, I actually think this is a great introduction to just how countries around the world are responding to these challenges. And one of the examples we were reading was about Israel and how, because they can't depend on other countries around them for resources, they've become very self-sufficient in their agriculture and in terms of water, and they've been using like desalination practices. And I think it's interesting to see how technology is beginning to help us, whether it's through, our water consumption or figuring out, like you said, the secure production of the goods. I think you were mentioning IoT and just especially hydroponics here in the region, because you were mentioning earlier in the podcast how, 80% of our water is used in agriculture, but less than 1% of our land is arable. So, you were mentioning how in your travels, you were trying to research and figuring out where you want to take this information that you've been learning. And I was wondering, what are some of the most interesting uses of technology that you've discovered in the past couple of years? And do you think some other than hydroponics can be used in our region?
Yeah, so I think first is it's incredibly important to think about localization. So hydroponics were used everywhere I went, but they were used very differently. So in Japan, they have inverted age pyramids. So their labor pool is actually decreasing. So for them, automation becomes incredibly important. So hydroponics was there, but there wasn't really a focus on optimizing the climate or optimizing growing. It was more about optimizing the labor that went into growing. And so you saw these massive hydroponic farms, but the focus was very much on automation and creating robots that could do that work. We don't have that problem. We have a massive supply of labor. When you start going to Holland, yes, hydroponics have been used for hundreds of years, but they've typically been used in greenhouses or semi-open structures. They don't have to deal with the harsh climate that we do. And so there wasn't that focus on the climate control aspect quite as strongly. In places in the States, like in Brooklyn or in San Francisco, a lot of the hydroponic farms that I saw there were focused on higher cost production methods, but they were also distributing to a fine gourmet industry segment, which is very large in those cities. And the cost of getting fine gourmet produce into those cities is very expensive. And so the problem is that even though hydroponics is a very stable way of growing, the implementation can be very different from place to place. And the problems that they're trying to solve can be very different. The way we've approached it is we've said, look, what if we combine hydroponics with vertical farming, which is just doing towers, and then with controlled environment agriculture. So we're a fully closed farm. We don't use sunlight. We replace it with LED lights. Everything in our farm is controlled. Now, the value proposition that gives us is, A, we can grow in places we couldn't before. So we have very limited farmland. We want to conserve that farmland for produce that we can't grow. And so we're located in an industrial zone called Kizat. Our tenants, our neighbors, are industrial tenants and neighbors. So we grow in places that we couldn't before. By having a completely enclosed environment, we're also able to create an optimal environment. And so we're able to choose the crops we want to grow and find the gaps in the market or find the places where we don't want to compete with local. We want to compete with import. We want to do import substitution. We want to eventually eliminate imports. And so we're able to grow things that weren't able to before. And by the way we're growing, we're HACCP certified, which means hazard analysis and critical control points. You don't see farms with that certification. You normally see hospitals, clinical areas, because we don't use pesticides. We don't use insecticides. Because we're indoors, we have an opportunity to be so clean that we don't need to use those chemicals. And we're local enough that we don't need to use preservatives. And so we're able to grow at a quality that you haven't seen before. That's our value proposition, growing things in places, things you haven't seen and at a higher quality and more securely than you have before. And so that's the problem we're trying to solve. And even though in the end, it's still the basics of hydroponics, it's very different from some of the approaches that we saw abroad. Localizing it to the problem statement is incredibly important.
I know you have a very busy day, but one last question is, I know that Madar Farm specializes in microgreens. Is that correct?
So today what we're growing is both microgreens and leafy salads, but what we're opening is vine crops, so tomatoes, and hopefully in the future we'll expand out that product portfolio. I think that's the goal of our R&D center, not only optimize our growing, but also widen our crop portfolio. Down the road, we want to be the brand that's recognized and that's top of mind. That's not just high quality, not just sustainable, but that can cater to as many of your needs as possible with the same approach.
And where can we find your produce, or how can we get them into our households?
If you go online on our website or go on any of our social media, you'll find all of our outlets listed. We are in retail. We are on e-commerce as well. Feel free to support us.
Of course you will, and I hope our listeners do as well.
I hope so too. But I think, look, if there's one thing we can ask you, aside from supporting us and other local farmers, is take the lessons you've learned, take the messages we've shared today. Our biggest challenge is awareness. Without awareness, without knowledge, without changing purchasing habits, then there is no demand for us, there is no place for us, and there is no place for other people doing things like us. And it all starts with you.
Thank you so much for your words, Abdulaziz.
Thank you, Hadeel.